So note that on earth, God extends his hospitality to all people, regardless of whether they deserve it or not. Did you notice that in everything I talked about, it's not that they got it because they deserved it, right? God extends this hospitality to people whether they deserve it or not. As Jesus says in Matthew 5:45, you see how many Bible verses I'm giving you tonight? This is such a common theme in the Bible. Matthew 5:45, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Human beings totally misunderstand this. We get confused when bad things happen to good people. We get confused when good things happen to bad people too. We expect that God should send good things to good people and bad things to bad people. But that is not God's character. You see, on earth, which is the home, his home, that he opens up to human beings, God is always a gracious host. He gives good things to all of his guests. And he gives them good things, even the ones that behave badly. Receive these good things. He does this because he is a generous host. That's the explanation of why anything happens to anybody, is because God is generous. So when Jesus talks about a reward, it is for the future life, the life to come, not this life. This is really key that we understand this. And you can see this in Matthew 5:12 and Luke 6:23. Matthew 5:12 and Luke 6:23. You'll notice in there that Jesus talks about receiving the reward, and I want you to look up when he says we receive it. It's not in this lifetime. We really need to understand this. This present life is not a life of rewards and punishments. Sure, there are consequences of sin that happen in this lifetime, and the Bible even talks about God chastening those that he loves. But we misunderstand God's character when we look at what happens to people in this life and we say God is rewarding them or God is punishing them. In this life, what we receive is God's gracious hospitality, regardless of whether we deserve it or not. And that is the fundamental meaning of the word grace. God's undeserved favor. Or you could even say God's undeserved hospitality. It is in the next life that God holds us accountable for the hospitality that we are receiving from him presently in this life. You see, we are going to be held accountable for the hospitality he gives us in this life. We're going to be held accountable for it in the next life. So when people ask, why did the wicked prosper? What is the answer? The answer is that the wicked aren't really prospering. Instead, they are receiving and abusing the grace of God, and they will be held accountable for that in the life to come. So God's gracious hospitality is also the basis on which Paul says that all human beings are held accountable by God in the life to come. Even those who have never heard of Christ in this life are held accountable for God's hospitality that they receive. And Paul writes about this in Romans 1:18 through 23. Write that down, Romans 1:18 through 23, because that is the passage that we are going to learn this week for family worship times. That's the one you got to memorize. Okay? And children can learn, if you want, they can learn just the Romans 1:20 part. Okay? So if you're a child, Romans 1:20, but the rest of you, I want you to learn Romans 1:18 through 23. This is Paul talking about us being held accountable for God's hospitality in the life to come. Paul says the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. That's the appropriate response to hospitality. Giving thanks. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. So in the language we're using this month, we could paraphrase Paul's thought this way. God's hospitality is evident to everyone. God has made it obvious to everyone that they are being hosted. It is obvious that they receive gifts and goodness that they do not deserve. As a result, they have no excuse to not acknowledge the host. However, many human beings do not acknowledge God as the host. Instead, they think that other things, nature or animals or fake gods or even other human beings, are their hosts or benefactors. Or they just take credit for things by the basis of their own abilities. And as they worship these things, everything about their understanding of the world and of themselves becomes foolishness. So, the knowledge of God in nature, the sunshine, the rain, our ability to live and move and breathe, the technical term for that is natural theology. But this is not only this is not the only way that God shows His goodness. God has an all-around goodness which is manifested through His personal love and care to all humans, not just those who believe in His Son Jesus. And that is what we call His hospitality. Because when you think about it, God answers a lot of prayers of people, not just the people who are Christian, right? And He does a lot of miraculous things for people who have never even heard of or who have never shown any love towards Jesus. So we have a name for that hospitality of God, that host-like grace of God that He shows to all human beings, which often gives us an awareness of the reality of God even before we come to understand that we're sinners and Christ is our Savior. And we call this prevenient grace.
Hear the word, do the word. .w